There are things a woman is not supposed to survive in Regency England: the public humiliation of her name, the deliberate erasure of her face, the slow, calculated dismantling of everything she was by the man who swore before God to protect her. Most women, when broken in such a way, quietly disappear. Cecily Montfort did not disappear. She waited. The night it began, 500 candles burned in the great hall of Dunmore Park, and the Duke of Ravenscroft stood at the head of the feast table, like a man conducting his own coronation. Julian Montfort, the 5th Duke of Ravenscroft, was the kind of man England built myths around. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw carved from cold marble and eyes the precise shade of a winter sea, neither blue nor gray, but something unreadable, something that had not always been so closed. He had returned from 18 months on the continent 2 days prior, and already the county was breathless. Already the whispers had begun again. His duchess had not been invited to the feast. That detail, small and precise as a blade between the ribs, was not lost on a single guest present. They sat in their finest silks and their borrowed diamonds, these lords and ladies of the first circle, and they noticed the empty chair at the far end of the table. They noticed the way the Duke did not glance at it, not once. They noticed, and they said nothing, because silence in high society is not the absence of cruelty. It is its most refined expression. Cecily Montfort sat instead in a small upstairs parlor at the far end of the east wing, a book open in her lap that she had not read a single word of in the past hour. She was 26 years old, and by every outward measure, she was precisely what a Regency duchess was supposed to be: graceful, composed, unremarkable in her obedience. But there was something in the set of her mouth, something quiet and absolute that a careful observer might have noticed. Not defeat, something older than defeat, something that had been sharpened by it. She had a secret. She had possessed it for over 2 years, through every cold silence and every public slight, through the whispers and the averted eyes of women who had once called her friend. She had carried it with the discipline of a soldier and the patience of a woman who understood that timing was everything. The secret was not small. It was not the kind of thing that could be managed with a polite letter or a dignified withdrawal. It was the kind of secret that, when revealed at the right moment in the right room, would not merely wound the Duke of Ravenscroft, it would unmake him. Below, the laughter of his guests rose through the floorboards like smoke. And then she heard it. A sudden hush, the particular silence of a crowd that has collectively witnessed something they cannot yet comprehend. Then a single voice, sharp with scandal, cutting through the stillness like a stone through glass. She set down her book. She already knew what they had seen. What she did not yet know was that by morning, what had happened in that hall would make what she carried infinitely more dangerous, and the war between them entirely inevitable. She was on her feet before she had made the conscious decision to move. Not from panic, from recognition. The silence below had a texture she knew. The held breath of a room full of people witnessing something they would be dining out on for the next 10 years. She crossed to the parlor door, opened it without hurry, and stood at the top of the east staircase. The smell reached her first, smoke, and beneath it, the faint chemical sweetness of oil paint curling in heat. Then she saw it. At the far end of the great hall, where the grand fireplace yawned wide enough to swallow a man standing, a footman stood, with iron tongs and an expression of visible distress. On the grate, already blackening at the edges, already losing its face to flame, was a portrait. Her portrait, the one that had hung in the gallery of Dunmore Park since the first year of their marriage. Cecily at 22, rendered in oils by the finest portraitist in London, wearing a gown of deep ivory and a composed, careful smile that had cost her an entire morning of stillness to maintain. Julian stood with his back to the fire, facing his guests, a glass of port in one hand. He did not look at the painting. He did not need to. His message required no footnotes. Around the table, no one spoke. Lady Forsyth had gone the color of old wax. Lord Pemberton stared at his wine-glass with sudden and intense concentration. The Honourable Miss Sinclair, seated near the middle, pressed her fingers over her lips. They were appalled, every single one of them, and not one of them would say so aloud. Because the Duke of Ravenscroft controlled half the appointments in the county and the other half lived in dread of his displeasure, Cecily stood at the top of the stairs and watched her own face disappear into the fire. She felt something move through her. Not the grief she might have expected, not the humiliation she was certainly intended to feel. Something quieter and far more dangerous. Confirmation. He had just handed her something without realizing it. He had shown every witness in that room exactly who he was, and he had done it in front of people whose memories were long, and whose loyalties, under the right circumstances, could shift. She turned and went back to her parlor. She closed the door. She sat down, picked up her book, and read every word on the page with perfect clarity for the next 2 hours. When the guests finally departed and the candles guttered low, Dunmore Park fell silent, and Cecily Montfort allowed herself a single, slow breath. Then she opened the drawer of the writing desk, removed a folded letter she had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, and held it in both hands. The war had begun. He simply did not know she had been preparing for it for over 2 years. The morning after the feast, she came down to breakfast to find a different kind of weapon waiting for her. It was laid across her chair, her finest evening gown, the one she had commissioned from the best modiste in London for the approaching coronation celebrations, a deep blue silk with silver thread that had taken 3 fittings and 6 weeks to complete. It had been placed there deliberately, folded with a contemptuous care, with a single card resting on top. The handwriting was Julian's. The message was 4 words: "You will not attend." She stood very still for a moment. She picked up the card. She set it down. She rang for her maid, ate her breakfast, and then sent a note to her second cousin, Dorothea Cavendish, 3 miles away, requesting her company at her earliest convenience. Before Dorothea arrived, a second message came from Julian's secretary, delivered with the rigid formality of a man following orders he found distasteful. The Duke had arranged for the gown to be collected and destroyed. He had also communicated to the modiste in London that the Duchess's account was to be considered closed. She was not to be fitted, served, or received. She would have no gown for the coronation. She would have no invitation. She would, if her husband had his way, cease to exist as a social entity of any consequence before the season was out. Cecily thanked the secretary pleasantly and closed the door. She went to the window and looked out at the grounds of Dunmore Park, the lawns and the rose garden and the long elm drive, all of it technically hers as much as his, all of it increasingly a cage. She was 26 years old. She had been married for 4 years, and she had spent the last 25 months cataloguing precisely what she was willing to endure in service of patience. She had now reached the end of the catalogue. Dorothea arrived within the hour, swept through the door, took one look at the empty chair and said, "Tell me everything that happened last night and this morning in the correct order and leave nothing out." Cecily told her. When she had finished, Dorothea sat in silence for a full 10 seconds, which was, for Dorothea, an eternity of restraint. Then she said, "He burned your portrait in front of 40 witnesses, had your finest gown removed from your own chair, barred you from your modiste, and intends to exclude you from the coronation. That is a complete summary. Then we are no longer being patient." Dorothea stood up. "We are being strategic. And the moment for strategy arrived approximately 25 months ago, and we have been extraordinarily generous with our forbearance." She crossed to Cecily's writing desk. "You still have the letter. I have never not had it. And the copy? In the box. In the place you know." Dorothea nodded, her expression sharp with focus. "The coronation is in 5 weeks. Lord Cavendish is on the Lord Chamberlain's reception list. You will come as my guest. Julian cannot bar you from attending as the guest of a peer without making a scene at the palace itself, which even he will not risk at a coronation." She began writing. "As for the gown, he closed your account at his modiste. He has no authority over mine. And Madame Leclerc holds particular views about the treatment of women that make her a natural ally in precisely this situation. You will have a gown that makes the burning of the last one look like the greatest act of self-defeat in the history of the English aristocracy." Cecily watched her cousin write and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly. Something colder and more reliable than hope. Readiness. But there was still the matter of the letter, and what it meant, not only for Julian, but for Cecily herself and for the choice she had been deferring for over 2 years. She had found it 25 months ago, 7 months into Julian's absence on the continent. A sealed dispatch addressed to the Duke, the wax cracked in transit. She had begun to set it aside for forwarding, and then one line, visible through the broken seal, had stopped her entirely. She had sat down and read every word. What the letter contained was evidence that the Duke of Ravenscroft had entered into a financial arrangement with a minister of a foreign government currently engaged in negotiations hostile to British interests. Read without context, it was devastating. It was the kind of document that, placed before the right eyes, could end a man's title, his career, and every connection he had spent a lifetime building. She had copied it in her own hand, locked both versions away, and said nothing. Not because she lacked the resolve to act, but because she had loved Julian Montfort since her 21st year, and love, she had discovered, is not a condition that submits readily to logic or self-interest. She had held the secret and waited for understanding, some explanation that would make the shape of what she had read cohere with the man she believed she had married. He had come home and given her nothing, and then, instead of explanation, had come the systematic cruelty, small at first, then gathering momentum. The portrait had been the end of patience. The gown was the beginning of war. What neither Cecily nor Dorothea knew, as they sat planning that morning, was that Julian Montfort was at that precise moment staring at a report that had arrived 2 days after his return. A report that had stopped every other thought cold. Someone had accessed the dispatch he had sent to Dunmore Park. He had feared it since the moment the damaged seal was reported. But fear had been abstract until now. The report confirmed it in plain language. The dispatch had been read. A copy had been made, and he had no way of knowing who held it. He had come home already sealed, already committed to the distance he believed was the only protection he could offer, and the confirmation had snapped that distance shut like a trap. He had not burnt the portrait from contempt. An intercepted communication from the same hostile network responsible for the original dispatch had identified the Duke's Duchess and her considerable influence over him as a potential pressure point. He had burned her portrait to make her appear worthless to him, publicly, irrevocably, before an audience large enough that the performance would be believed. He had removed the gown and barred her from the coronation for the same reason. The ceremony would draw every political figure of consequence in England. If she appeared visibly as his cherished wife, she became a target. He was trying, with the bluntness of a man who had forgotten every language except force, to keep her safe, and he was making a catastrophic ruin of it. The problem he had not yet apprehended was that his wife had not spent 25 months in passive, waiting. She had spent 25 months building something, and whatever she had built, the same instinct that had kept him alive on the continent was telling him with quiet urgency that it was not small. Their first real conversation in over a year happened not in any grand room of Dunmore Park, but in the narrow corridor outside the library, by pure collision. Cecily was carrying a stack of estate ledgers. Julian came around the corner at the same moment. They stopped 3 feet apart, and the silence between them had the quality of two people who have been expertly avoiding each other and have suddenly run out of house. The ledgers, he said, not what he had meant to say. Yes. She held his gaze with an expression that gave nothing. I have been managing the accounts in your absence. I can brief the steward if you wish to reassume the responsibility. You did this alone. I did everything alone, Julian, for 18 months, and then for 14 more. One becomes capable of a great deal when the alternatives collapse. He said nothing. She moved to step past him, and he said quietly, Cecily, I need to speak with you this evening in the library. Please. The word please arrested her. She turned and looked at him properly for the first time. Not through him, not past him, but at him. He looked older in the way of a man carrying something very heavy for a very long time without sleeping well. This evening, she said. After supper. He was there when she arrived, standing by the cold fireplace, his rehearsed words already abandoned. She sat across from him and said, You wish to speak. He did. He spoke for nearly 2 hours. What emerged, halting and stripped of every defense he had built over 4 years, was the full shape of what the portrait burning and the gown had actually meant. The dispatch, the broken seal, the hostile network that had marked her as a vulnerability. His return already committed to the performance of a man with nothing for his wife, so that anyone watching would find her useless as a weapon against him. And then the operation on the continent itself, far more complicated than the letter alone suggested. He had not entered the financial arrangement for personal gain or from disloyalty. He had done it as the final stage of an unofficial intelligence operation, sanctioned by a now deceased government official, designed to expose a network working against British interests across 3 countries. The arrangement had been a trap, and it had succeeded, but the man who had authorized Julian's role had died before documenting it properly. He had come home carrying evidence that looked, to any uninformed eye, like private treason, unable to explain it to anyone, without implicating living members of the operation and the families of the dead. He had sealed himself, because silence was the only thing he could offer that felt like protection. He had been catastrophically wrong about what protection actually looked like. Cecily listened to all of it. When he finished, the fire had burned low and the house was completely still. You knew someone had read the dispatch, she said. I suspected from the start. I knew with certainty 6 months after I returned. The steward mentioned in passing that you had reorganized the Eastern correspondence files. I went to check something unrelated and found the gap. He met her eyes. I have known for 8 months. 8 months, she held that. You knew I had it and you burned my portrait anyway. To protect you. To make you appear worthless to people who would use you against me. I know how that sounds now. At the time, it was the only tactic that seemed workable. You destroyed my dignity in front of 40 people, she said, to protect me from hypothetical enemies, without asking me whether I wished to be protected in that particular manner. Yes, his voice was raw. It was wrong. It was the action of a man who had spent too long thinking tactically and had entirely forgotten how to think humanely. I have caused you damage I have no right to minimize. Cecily looked at him across the room. She thought about the letter in the locked box. She thought about Dorothea's plan, the coronation in 5 weeks, the gown being made at this moment at Madame Leclerc's. She thought about the 25 months she had spent holding a burning coal in her hands, waiting to understand what she was holding. The letter needs to go through Lord Cavendish, she said. A private channel. Your authorized role documented quietly, and the file closed without a public record. No names exposed, no network compromised. He was very still. You had already arranged a public version. I am now choosing the private one, because the private one is what is actually correct. She held his gaze. There are conditions. Name them. I attend the coronation, at your side, in a gown of my own choosing, which you will pay for without comment. She watched his face. And there is one thing more. It concerns a portrait. He waited. The Lord Chamberlain's office sent a request to the great houses 4 months ago for portraits to hang in the palace gallery during the coronation. Celebrations. I know this because I handle the household correspondence. She stood. Your secretary, following standard procedure, replied on your behalf that the Ravenscroft portrait had been lost in an incident, and there was none available for submission. I read that reply. I disagreed with it. She crossed to the writing desk and opened the lower drawer. She removed a rolled canvas, not large, secured with a ribbon, and set it on the table between them. I had this painted 18 months into your absence. A portraitist came from the city. The household staff believed it was a personal commission. It is not of me. He looked at the rolled canvas. I painted you, she said, because I was trying to remember the man I had married before I began to forget him entirely. I intended to burn it eventually. I found I could not. She looked at him steadily. I have already written to the Lord Chamberlain's office requesting a place in the gallery for a late Ravenscroft. Submission. The coronation is in 5 weeks. If I submit it, it hangs in the palace. Every person of consequence in England sees it. They see that I commissioned a portrait of my husband during his long absence. They understand what that means. She let a moment pass. It will say something about this marriage that 40 dinner guests watching a portrait burn could not unsay. Julian looked at the canvas for a long time. Something moved through his expression that had no name she could give it. You painted me, he said quietly. I painted the man I believed still existed underneath whatever the continent had done to him. She folded her hands. I was correct, as it turns out. Though it took considerable time to confirm, he looked up at her. Cecily, the decision is yours, she said. But I believe that what I can do in that gallery, with that portrait, will answer what you did at the feast more completely than anything else, available to either of us. I can remake what you unmade, but I require your agreement, and I require your complete honesty from this point forward. No more decisions made in silence. No more protection I have not consented to. We face things together or not at all. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire had burned to embers. The candles were very low. Submit it, he said. Then start talking, she replied. All of it tonight. The westerly accounts too, because the figures have not balanced for 2 quarters, and I want to know why. He almost smiled. Then he got up, went to the locked desk, and began removing papers. They talked until past midnight. It was the most ordinary, essential, irreversible conversation of their marriage. Lord Cavendish received the letter 3 days later. He handled it with the efficiency of a man accustomed to managing situations that exist in the space between official record and unofficial necessity. Within a fortnight, the file was closed, Julian's authorized role documented, and the entanglement that had poisoned 2 years of their life quietly dissolved. Julian told no one except Cecily. She had already known it would happen because she had sat with Cavendish herself the afternoon before and walked him through every detail with the methodical clarity of a woman who had been studying the problem for 25 months. Cavendish had looked at her afterward and said, with frank precision, that she had handled the matter with more intelligence and discretion than 3/4 of the men in his acquaintance. Cecily had thanked him and confirmed the timeline for the portrait's delivery to the palace. The gown arrived from Madame Leclerc 4 days before the coronation. Dorothea had been involved in its design, and Dorothea was, in all things, entirely without moderation when the occasion called for impact. It was ivory and gold, a color, not of a woman trying to disappear, but of a woman who has decided to be fully, permanently seen. The embroidery at the hem was so fine it caught light like frost on a window. With it came a velvet case containing the Montfort family jewels. diamonds and deep sapphires that had last been worn by Julian's grandmother at the previous coronation, pieces his mother had withheld from Cecily since the wedding, with the particular thoroughness of a woman who does not acknowledge marriages she opposed. Julian had retrieved them himself 2 days before. In a conversation with his mother that the household staff discussed in awed whispers for weeks afterward. When Cecily lifted the necklace from the velvet, she understood precisely what it meant in the visual grammar of society. There was not a person of consequence at the coronation who would not recognize those pieces. There was not a guest who would fail to understand that the Duke of Ravenscroft had dressed his wife in his family's history and brought her before all of England at his side. The morning of the coronation was clear and cold, the kind of London morning that smells of stone and occasion. They rode to the palace in the Ravenscroft carriage, and Cecily sat straight-backed in the gold gown, with the Montfort diamonds at her throat, and thought with full clarity about everything that had brought her to this carriage. The portrait in its flames, the gown folded across her chair, the 25 months of a cold and silent house, and the night in the library when a man who had forgotten how to speak the truth had finally remembered. Julian sat across from her. He watched her with an attention he had entirely stopped concealing. "You look," he began, and then found the sentence insufficient. "I know," she said, "not vanity, simply recognition." He smiled, a real one, the kind that undid his face completely. She had nearly forgotten what it did to him. "I owe you an extraordinary amount," he said. "You do," she agreed. "We can itemize it later. We are about to enter the palace." They were seen. All of London had heard the story of the burned portrait. All of London saw them arrive together, the Montfort diamonds catching the morning light, the Duke's hand placed under his wife's arm with a care that no one in that crowd had ever witnessed from him before. The story that had been told about the Duchess of Ravenscroft, invisible, discarded, pitied, met the fact of her walking through those palace doors in his family's jewels, and simply collapsed. Lady Forsyth found Cecily within the first 20 minutes of the reception. She took both her hands and said, very quietly, "I owe you an apology. I was present that night, and I said nothing. I am saying something now." "You are saying something now," Cecily replied. "That is the part that matters." Julian stayed at her side for every hour of the reception. He introduced her to men who had political consequence. He spoke plainly about the hospital wing under construction at the Ravenscroft estate village and attributed it to his wife without equivocation. He was, in the most deliberate way available, remaking in public what he had unmade in public. The portrait hung in the gallery above the processional hall, as the Lord Chamberlain's office had confirmed the previous week. It was positioned among the great houses of England, each crest and bloodline represented in oils and gilt frames, and the Ravenscroft portrait was among them. Not the formal commissioned likeness of a duchess in ivory, but a painting of Julian Montfort himself, rendered in the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who knows their subject, not from a single sitting but from years of careful, painful observation. He was standing in what was recognizably the library at Dunmore Park, turned slightly away from the viewer, his face in three-quarter profile, one hand resting on a shelf of books. He looked neither cold nor composed. He looked like a man who was thinking about something that mattered to him. Cecily had painted him during the bleakest stretch of his absence, when she had begun to fear she was losing the exact shape of his face. She had painted him from memory and from love, and both showed in every line of it. The guest who noticed it first was a prominent member of the political establishment, a man who had known Julian for 15 years. He stopped in the processional hall, looked at the portrait, looked at the card beside it that read in plain copperplate, "Commissioned by the Duchess of Ravenscroft," and then turned to find Julian and Cecily approaching along the gallery. He looked at them for a moment. Then he said to Julian, with the directness of an old acquaintance. "Your wife painted that." "She did," Julian said. The man looked at Cecily. "During his absence." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the most comprehensive statement I have seen made in a public gallery in 30 years of attending these occasions." He inclined his head to her and moved on. Julian looked at the portrait. He had seen it unrolled in the library that night when she had placed it between them on the table, and the force of it had silenced him. It silenced him now, differently, because here, in the palace, among England's assembled consequence, it was not a private communication between a wife and her estranged husband. It was a declaration. She had painted him with the full attention of a woman who had refused, even when she had every reason to stop believing something real existed inside the man she married, and she had hung it in the most public room available. He had burned her portrait to make her invisible. She had hung his to make them both seen. He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him, with a composed steadiness he had spent years misreading as detachment, and had come to understand was something else entirely. A woman who had always known her own mind and had been waiting with exceptional patience for him to catch up. "You did that for me," he said quietly. "I did it for us," she said. "There is a difference." He reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and they stood together in the processional hall of the palace, with the Montfort diamonds at her throat, and his portrait on the wall above them. And neither of them spoke for a moment, because nothing necessary remained unsaid. The months that followed were different from anything that had come before. Not in the way of fairy stories, where transformation arrives complete and painless, but in the way of real things, gradual and imperfect and built by daily effort. The drainage work on the eastern farms was finished that autumn. The hospital wing broke ground in October. Julian attended the groundbreaking and named his wife in his address without hesitation, and the county, which had spent 2 years constructing a particular story about the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft, was required to dismantle it entirely. His mother came in November and conducted her inspection with the manner of a general reviewing reformed troops. She found the household accounts flawless, the tenants' conditions substantially improved, and her daughter-in-law deep in architectural correspondence, with the focused energy of a woman who has located her purpose and intends to pursue it without apology. The dowager said nothing complimentary to Cecily directly, because that was not her nature, but at dinner on the 5th evening, she referred to the hospital project, my daughter-in-law's initiative, in a tone that closed the subject against further commentary. It was the most substantial endorsement in her vocabulary. Lord Cavendish received a case of excellent port. Dorothea received the first edition she had wanted for 3 years, and a letter of such specific, honest gratitude that she read it twice in her garden, and was thereafter unusually quiet for the rest of the afternoon, which her husband noted with private astonishment. Spring came back to Dunmore Park. The roses came in along the south garden wall, and one evening Cecily was there, reading a letter from the hospital architect, when Julian appeared beside her. He had developed the habit of finding her wherever she was, not with urgency, but with the quiet consistency of a man who has understood the cost of not paying attention and has no intention of repeating the error. He held out his hand. In his palm was a ring, not the formal Ravenscroft piece she had received at their wedding, heavy with obligation, but something new. A simple gold band, warm and plain, with words engraved inside too small to read without bringing it close. She took it. She turned it to the evening light. The words read, "I will not look away." She held it for a long moment. "You burned my portrait," she said, "because you could not bear for others to see that I mattered to you. And I painted yours because I could not bear to lose the knowledge that you were real." She looked up at him. We have been, between us, a comprehensive study in the various ways love can go wrong when two people refuse to speak plainly. A thorough study, he agreed, with extensive practical examples. You will be periodically very difficult, almost certainly, and there will be times, she said, when your instinct toward unilateral protection will require active correction. I expect that to be an ongoing project. It will be. She slid the ring onto her finger beside the first one. 2 rings. 2 entirely different promises. I have one condition, you always do. The northeastern boundary on the westerly drainage map. It is still wrong. I have written to the county surveyor twice and been ignored on both occasions. And I want you to write the 3rd letter, because your name on the envelope produces a different quality of attention than mine. He looked at her. The northeastern boundary. Come and look at the map. He came. They stood over it in the library as the light changed and the candles were lit, and argued about the boundary for considerably longer than the matter strictly required. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it was entirely enough. On the 1st anniversary of the coronation, Cecily stood in the south garden reading a letter from Dorothea, who had become entangled in a different sort of drama involving a Scottish earl and a disputed inheritance which was a story for another time. The evening was warm, the light long and golden, and the roses were fully out along the south wall, where she had stood 25 months of difficult choices ago, and first begun to understand what patience was actually for. Julian appeared at her elbow. The Dowager has suggested she may visit in August, he said. I know. I invited her. He looked at her. You invited her. She has her uses, and she has been, in her way, an ally. Cecily tucked the letter into her pocket. Do not look so alarmed. I have been managing your mother for 4 years. I am very good at it. I know, he said. It is one of the more remarkable things about you. There are many. She turned to look at him. This man she had loved and nearly given up on, who had been a stranger and a source of pain, and was now simply, essentially, hers, arrived at through the longest and most complicated route imaginable, and the more certain for it. You still owe me, she said, extensively. I intend to collect it gradually. She took his arm, over a very long time. I am counting on it, he said. The estate spread out behind them in the evening light, roses and elm and well-tended land, a place that had been a cage and become a home through nothing more or less miraculous than 2 people choosing, repeatedly and deliberately, to remain honest with each other. The pain had been real, the distance had been vast, but love had not arrived as a sudden rescue. It had arrived as a decision, made in a cold library, confirmed in a palace gallery, renewed in a rose garden at dusk, and they made it again every day with every shared glance and every ordinary argument and every quiet hour spent, side by side in the work of a shared life. It was enough. It was everything. If this story moved you, we would love to know which moment stayed with you. Leave us a comment, and if you haven't already subscribed, please do, because there are more stories where this one came from. Stories of women who waited, who planned, who held their ground, and who changed everything when the moment was exactly right. We will see you in the next one.